It's strange, isn't it? How a whole world can collapse in a single minute. 1 minute you're standing in the warmth of your kitchen, the hum of the freezer in the background, the smell of dinner still clinging to the air. And the next, your child is gone. No warning, no sound, just gone. August 22nd, 1983, Sheridan, Colorado. A day so ordinary, no one could have guessed it would be carved into local memory like a scar. Arthur Miller had worked the morning shift at the post office. He came home, kissed his wife on the cheek, and walked into the kitchen to grab popsicles for his kids. Just 60 seconds, maybe less. A harmless act. Outside, his little girl, Lori, rode her red tricycle, sunlight catching the curls in her hair. Her laughter echoed off the houses. Her brother, Toby, traded baseball cards with a neighbor. It was the kind of day that feels safe. The kind of day you don't realize you'll never get back. When Arthur opened the freezer door, he could hear them playing. When he closed it, he couldn't. He walked to the window. The tricycle was still there. The ball she'd been tossing sat in the middle of the sidewalk. But Lori was gone. The world doesn't always explode when it ends. Sometimes it just goes quiet. Arthur ran outside, shouting her name until his throat cracked. Toby pointed down the street, his eyes wide and wet. He tried to speak, but only managed a broken whisper. She went with the man, the one in the orange car. Arthur's stomach turned to stone. He sprinted down the block, his voice tearing through the still air, neighbors spilling out of their homes, fear spreading like wildfire. Every parent knows that kind of scream, the one that doesn't sound human anymore. That's the sound that came from Aster Street that day. The calm neighborhood, trimmed lawns, bright flowers, neat fences, suddenly felt wrong, like a painting ripped open. Police arrived within minutes. Questions flew, descriptions were shouted, but Lori was nowhere. Her name echoed between houses, and the sound of that echo, that desperate, hollow echo, would haunt the entire town. It always starts like this, in places that feel safe. People think danger wears a warning sign, but it doesn't. It hides in the ordinary. If you believe this couldn't happen where you live, you're already too comfortable. Subscribe now, because the moment we stop paying attention, that's when the monsters move in. The first night stretched into the second day without a trace. The sun came up, but it didn't feel like morning anymore. By then, the Miller house had become command central. Maps, coffee cups, half-eaten sandwiches, everything scattered across the dining table. The phone never stopped ringing. Reporters lined the street, lights flashing against the windows. Arthur Miller barely noticed them. He sat by the kitchen window, staring out at the tricycle they still hadn't moved. He couldn't. To him, it wasn't a toy anymore. It was the last proof that she'd been there. Elena sat at the table, motionless. Her hands were clasped so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Neighbors came and went with food, condolences, whispered prayers. But all Elena could think about was the single minute she'd looked away. 1 minute. People talk about guilt like it's a feeling. It's not. It's a weight, pressing on your chest, stealing your breath, turning every sound into accusation. Lieutenant Valdez knocked gently on the door. Arthur opened it, and the officer's face said everything words couldn't. There were no leads yet. No witnesses who saw the man's face clearly. Just fragments, a flash of orange paint, a half-heard engine, a guess at a direction. Arthur nodded like he understood, but he didn't. How could anyone? By afternoon, volunteers formed search parties again. They combed through ditches, parks, and wooded edges of town. Helicopters hovered overhead. Every time someone shouted, everyone froze, waiting for a name to echo back. But it never did. Toby stayed on the porch. He wouldn't come inside. Every time someone said Lori's name, he flinched, like the sound hurt him. He didn't play anymore. He didn't even look at his toys. He just stared down the street, waiting for the red car to come back. Neighbors whispered about it at night, about how quickly something innocent could disappear. They talked about locking their doors, holding their kids closer, walking them to the bus stop. But under all that talk was a different fear, the kind no one wanted to admit, that maybe no one was safe anymore. By the end of day 2, the case was all over the news. Reporters camped outside. Every hour brought a new theory. Was it a stranger passing through? Someone from the town? A mistake or a plan? Each headline made the air heavier. That night, Arthur sat in his car at the edge of town. He couldn't go home. He just stared at the highway, gripping the steering wheel until his hands went numb. He thought about all the cars that had passed that day. Hundreds, maybe thousands. How many of them carried someone who noticed nothing? How many people drove by without realizing a little girl was in danger? He slammed his fist against the dashboard. The sound echoed in the stillness. He whispered, "How could no one see her?" But the only answer was the hum of the highway. In cases like these, silence becomes a weapon. Every minute without a clue feels like betrayal. And when hope starts slipping away, people begin turning on each other. That's what happened next. By the morning of the 3rd day, the whispers in Sheridan were no longer about prayer or sympathy. They were about blame. By the 3rd day, Sheridan didn't feel like home anymore. Every street looked different now. Familiar faces avoided eye contact. Conversations stopped when someone walked by, and doors that once stayed open now shut quickly. The Miller family had become both pitied and feared. People wanted to comfort them but didn't know how. What do you say to a mother whose child vanished in daylight? Elena barely left the house. The television blared updates from the local news replaying the same photo of Lori. Her dimpled smile, her bright eyes, the missing poster now plastered across town. Arthur didn't watch anymore. He couldn't bear hearing strangers talk about his daughter like she was a headline. Outside, volunteers gathered for another search. They fanned out in groups following mapped grids provided by police. But the tone had changed. The conversations weren't hopeful anymore. They were defensive, nervous. Everyone wanted to help. Everyone also wanted to be sure no one thought they were the one. In small towns, fear spreads fast. It sticks to people's voices, seeps into every look, every silence. The gossip started quietly. A few whispers at the diner, a few uneasy glances at the grocery store. Soon it became something sharper. Some blamed the Millers, others blamed the police. Most just blamed each other. A rumor began about a man who'd been seen near the playground a week before. Another about a delivery driver who'd asked for directions too many times. Theories piled on top of theories until no one could tell what was true anymore. For Lieutenant Valdez and his team, every tip was a spark, but most led nowhere. They chased phone calls, investigated license plates, searched abandoned lots. Every time they thought they had something, it vanished like smoke. Arthur started going on the searches himself. He'd walk for hours, through fields and side roads, calling her name until his voice cracked. People offered him pity. He didn't want pity. He wanted purpose. He wanted someone to look him in the eye and say they were sorry for not seeing the car when it mattered. On the evening of the 3rd day, Elena finally stepped outside. The air was cold. The streetlights flickered. Neighbors watched from their porches, pretending not to. She walked to the end of the street and stared at the spot where Lori's tricycle had been. The police had taken it for evidence, but the concrete still showed faint red streaks from the tires. Elena knelt, pressing her hand against the mark, as if she could still feel her daughter's warmth through it. Her voice was barely a whisper. "She's out there, I can feel it." But hope like that, fragile, trembling, made some people uncomfortable. They preferred the clean certainty of blame. The next morning, a local paper ran a headline. "Could the kidnapper be one of us?" That single sentence split the town in half. Theories became accusations. Accusations became rage. At a grocery store, 2 neighbors shouted over the cereal aisle, one accusing the other's cousin of knowing too much. At the gas station, a mechanic was nearly attacked because someone swore they'd seen him repaint an old car. By that night, even the police began to feel the strain. Valdez could sense the community slipping, reason giving way to panic. But he also knew that sometimes panic shakes something loose. Sometimes people talk when they're scared. And that's exactly what he needed. The next morning, the call came in. A woman who worked at a local motel said she'd seen a car matching the description. Faded orange, dented door, parked near the edge of town late Monday night. The license plate was partially covered in dirt, but she'd written down what she could. Valdez's pen stopped mid-note. The pattern fit. The car was registered to a man named Vernon Koss. By then, the town's fear had found a name. And once fear finds a name, it stops feeling guilty for destroying everything else. The address led them to a dull gray building at the edge of town. Peeling paint. Blinds drawn. No welcome mat. No sound. Lieutenant Valdez stood at the door with two detectives. He knocked once, twice. A chain rattled, then a slow click of the lock. The man who opened the door looked ordinary. Too ordinary. Vernon Koss, late 30s. Gaunt. A smudge of engine grease on his wrist. His eyes didn't dart around like a guilty man's should. They just stared, empty and tired, as if he'd been waiting for this visit. Inside, the apartment smelled of bleach. Counters wiped spotless, no dishes, no clutter, no warmth. The walls were bare except for a single clock that ticked too loud. Valdez scanned the room and felt his gut tighten. Not because he saw something wrong, but because he didn't. "Mr. Koss," he said quietly, "we're following up on a missing child. A little girl named Lori Miller." Koss nodded once, slow. "I saw it on the news," he answered. His voice was even, almost gentle. Sick world. He didn't invite them to sit, but Valdez did anyway. He asked about his car, the faded Orange Sedan registered under his name. Koss said he hadn't driven it in 2 days. One of the detectives, Alvarez, asked where he'd been Monday afternoon. Koss shrugged. "Home, fixing the water heater." "Anyone who can confirm that?" Valdez asked. "No one comes here?" Silence. Just the sound of the clock. They searched his car later that night. The same dull orange paint. The dent on the passenger side matched what the witness described, but the inside looked like it had been scrubbed until the fabric nearly tore. A faint smell of chemical cleaner lingered. Too strong. Too recent. Forensic techs collected fibers, samples, anything that might speak louder than Koss ever would. Back in the interview room, the man sat perfectly still, hands folded, eyes fixed on the table. Valdez leaned forward. "You understand how this looks, right?" Koss nodded. "I do." "Then help me out," Valdez said. "If you didn't take that girl, who did?" Koss tilted his head like he was considering the question. When he finally spoke, it came out as barely more than a whisper. "People disappear every day, Lieutenant. Maybe she just walked away." Arthur Miller was in the next room, listening through a glass wall. He lunged toward the door before officers held him back. "Walked away?" he shouted. "She's 3 years old." Valdez slammed his notebook shut. He'd seen anger before, but the kind that burned in Arthur's eyes wasn't anger anymore. It was loss trying to find a target. Hours turned into night. Koss kept the same expression, not smug, not afraid, just blank. Every question ended in the same wall of silence. Every pause made the room colder. Finally, Valdez stood. He'd gotten nothing but an emptiness that felt worse than denial. They had to let him go. Outside, flashes from news cameras exploded as Koss stepped into the parking lot. The crowd shouted, "Monster! Where is she?" Someone threw a bottle. It shattered near his feet. Koss didn't flinch. He just kept walking until the darkness swallowed him. Arthur Miller watched from a distance, shaking with rage. To him, that man's calm was a confession. But inside, even Valdez wasn't sure anymore. He'd seen guilty men panic, cry, lie, fold. But not this. That night, Sheridan wasn't just afraid anymore. It was furious. Posters of Lori hung in every store window, every mailbox, every car windshield. But new flyers appeared beside them. Bold letters scribbled in marker, "Arrest Koss now." The crowd wanted justice, not proof. and proof was taking too long. In the Miller house, Elena sat awake on the couch, the TV flickering. A reporter's voice played in the background, saying Koss's name over and over. Arthur paced behind her. He'd gone beyond hope now. Hope was for people who still believed in fairness. "I know it's him," he muttered. Elena didn't answer. Her eyes stayed fixed on the screen, her face pale in the blue light. Sometimes grief doesn't just want answers. It wants someone to bleed for the question. And Sheridan was ready to bleed someone dry. Day 4. The search teams moved slower now. No one said it aloud, but the energy had changed. Hope no longer sounded like belief. It sounded like routine. They walked through fields they'd already cleared, called her name into the same empty spaces, and waited for echoes that never came back. Each shout felt smaller than the one before. At headquarters, Lieutenant Valdez sat hunched over his desk. Stacks of reports, dozens of interviews. Every road led nowhere. The scent of stale coffee filled the room, mixed with the hum of police radios murmuring static. He rubbed his temples, staring at the wall of photos. Lori's face, the orange car, maps covered in circles. He'd promised Arthur they'd find her. Now, even he didn't believe it. When an officer stepped in with another possible sighting, Valdez didn't look up right away. He already knew it would end like the others. False hope, crushed under evidence that never materialized. "Check it anyway," he said. His voice had no weight left in it. At the Miller house, exhaustion hung heavier than grief. Elena sat in Lori's room, surrounded by toys that still smelled faintly of soap and childhood. She ran her fingers over the blankets, whispering prayers until her throat went raw. Arthur stood in the doorway. He'd stopped trying to comfort her, not because he didn't care, but because words felt useless now. They both existed in the same silence, just on opposite sides of it. He finally spoke. "They're not looking hard enough." Elena didn't answer. Arthur clenched his fists. "She's out there. I can feel it." His voice cracked halfway through the sentence, breaking under its own weight. He left before she could see the tears. Outside, reporters still camped on the curb. When Arthur stepped onto the porch, microphones rose like weapons. "Mr. Miller, do you think the suspect should be charged? Do you believe Vernon Koss is guilty?" He stared at them, hollow, sleepless eyes. The flash from the cameras burned spots in his vision. He said nothing. He just walked past them, down the street, the sound of his shoes against the pavement the only rhythm left in his life. Across town in a small diner, a group of locals sat in a booth arguing over coffee. Someone slammed a fist against the table. "They should have never let him go." Another nodded. "If the law won't do something, maybe we should." That was the moment the story stopped belonging to justice and started belonging to vengeance. By nightfall, whispers turned to plans. Someone said they'd seen Koss's car again near the old railway yard. Others swore they'd take care of it themselves. When Valdez heard the rumor, he sent 2 patrols to guard Koss's apartment, not to protect the town from him, but to protect him from the town. That's what hopelessness does. It flips the world upside down until right and wrong trade places. The following morning, a new storm rolled in. Heavy clouds, restless wind, as if the weather itself was tired of waiting. Valdez arrived at the Miller home. He stood in the doorway, hat in hand, searching for words that might mean something. "We're not giving up," he said. Arthur's jaw tightened. Elena stared past him. They'd heard those same 4 words every day for 4 days. Each time they meant less. When Valdez left, Arthur walked to the backyard. He sat on the old swing set he'd built himself. The chains creaked softly under his weight. He could still remember pushing Lori on that swing, her laughter bright against the wind. Now the same sound, the same gentle creak, felt cruel. He whispered her name once, just once into the wind. It vanished instantly, swallowed by distance. That's when something inside him finally broke. That night, Elena dreamed she heard crying. It was faint, somewhere outside the window. She woke with a start, heart pounding. But when she ran outside, the street was empty. She stood barefoot on the pavement, listening. Nothing. Still, for a second, she thought she'd heard it again. Softer, almost like a whisper. The next morning, she told Arthur. He said it was just a dream. But later that day, far away in the foothills, 2 hikers would hear something too. And theirs wouldn't be a dream. 4 days. That's how long she was gone. 4 days where no one saw, no one heard, no one acted fast enough. We always say, I'd do something if I were there. But would we? If you ever want to be the one who doesn't look away, subscribe to this channel now. Because awareness isn't curiosity, it's responsibility. By the end of the 4th day, Sheridan had nothing left to give. The flyers hung limp in the rain, the search grids blurred, and the Miller house stood silent. No one knew it yet, but help was already moving. Slow, uncertain, through the mountains west of town. And before another dawn arrived, a sound would rise from the ground that would change everything. Morning broke gray and heavy over the Colorado foothills. The air held that mountain chill that bites through layers and lingers in the lungs. Tall pines swayed slowly, their needles whispering against each other, breaking the quiet only when the wind dared move. It was a place most people passed by without stopping, too far from the main trails, too rugged for the casual hiker. To Gus and Becca Holman, it was perfect. They weren't adventurers or thrill seekers. They just wanted a little quiet, a place where the world stopped demanding so much. Gus, broad-shouldered with decades of farm work behind him, carried a small pair of binoculars around his neck. Becca followed close behind, clutching a thermos of coffee and a small notepad she used to jot down the birds they spotted. It was supposed to be their final trip before heading home to Nebraska. They parked near a dirt road that wound through dense trees and started their slow walk uphill. The morning was still, except for their footsteps crunching over gravel and pine needles. Strange place, Becca murmured, glancing around. Gus nodded. Doesn't look like anyone's been out here in years. They reached a clearing around mid-morning. At its edge stood a wooden structure. Small, tilted, half swallowed by weeds. An old outhouse, its roof sagging, door cracked open. A relic from another time. Gus wiped his brow. Guess people really used to rough it. Becca chuckled softly. Looks like something out of a ghost story. Her words hung in the cold air. Gus walked closer, pushing the door open with his boot. The hinges groaned. Inside it was dark, darker than it should have been for mid-morning. He leaned in, squinting through the shadows, when he heard it. A sound, so faint, he almost mistook it for the wind. He paused, listened. Nothing. He exhaled, stepping back. But just as he turned away, it came again. A short, fragile noise, buried under layers of silence. A cry? A whimper? He couldn't tell. He stepped forward again, pressing his ear toward the floorboards. The noise came once more, soft and uneven. Becca, he called quietly. She joined him at the doorway. What is it? He didn't answer right away. His eyes darted to the floor. The sound was faint, desperate, too human to ignore. Do you hear that? He whispered. They both knelt, pressing their ears to the boards. For a moment, all they could hear was the wind threading through the trees, and then faintly, a sound that froze them both. A voice. So small, so tired, it barely sounded alive. Help! Becca's hand flew to her mouth. Her eyes filled with tears before she could stop them. That's not a bird, she whispered. Oh my God, Gus, that's a child. Gus scrambled back, fumbling for his phone. His hands shook as he dialed emergency services. He could barely form the words. There's someone here, in the ground. We heard, no, it's real. A child's voice. Please hurry. He dropped the phone, running back toward the structure. Becca knelt beside the opening, calling softly. "Sweetheart, can you hear me? You're not alone anymore. We're here." No answer. She tried again, her voice trembling. "Keep talking, honey. Please say something." Another faint breath rose from below, just enough to prove she was still alive. The first responders arrived within the hour. The narrow dirt road made it slow going, but once they heard the sound for themselves, everything accelerated. The Jefferson County Sheriff's team set up around the outhouse, sectioning off the area as paramedics readied stretchers and oxygen tanks. Deputy Flynn, the first on scene, crouched low beside the floor. He pressed his ear down and the color drained from his face. He turned to the others. "She's alive." The rescuers worked fast but careful. They pulled away the warped planks, exposing the old shaft. A foul odor rose up, sharp and chemical, and the team recoiled, pulling scarves and masks over their mouths. Flashlights flickered into the dark. What they saw made every stomach turn. A small, motionless body deep inside, barely visible through the filth and shadows. The rescuer lowered into the pit shouted, "She's breathing." The sound of that single sentence cut through the chaos like lightning. Lori Miller, the missing girl from Sheridan, was alive. It took over an hour to bring her up. When they finally did, she was limp, filthy, and silent. Her eyes fluttered weakly against the light. The medics wrapped her in blankets, their voices hushed and trembling. One of them asked softly, "Honey, what's your name?" The little girl blinked once, lips cracked and dry. Her voice came out like a ghost of sound. "I live here now." 4 words, barely more than a whisper, but enough to shatter every heart within earshot. The next few hours were chaos, but not the loud kind. It was the kind filled with quiet panic, sharp orders, and the sound of boots moving fast across dirt. Every breath, every second, felt fragile. Deputy Flynn kept his voice low as he coordinated the scene. "Keep the noise down. She's conscious, barely. We don't want her to go into shock." Paramedics moved like clockwork, laying out blankets, lights, and oxygen masks on the ground. Their faces told the truth before their words did. Disbelief mixed with the kind of fear that only comes when you realize how close death had been. Gus stood back, holding Becca's hand. Neither of them spoke. They just watched the scene unfold, unable to process what they'd found. Becca's cheeks were streaked with tears, but her grip on Gus's hand never loosened. The sheriff arrived, his radio crackling with static as he barked orders to block the road and keep press away. But even he couldn't mask the tremor in his voice when he saw the small, motionless figure below. "Jesus," he whispered. "She's just a baby." The rescue team lowered one of their men into the shaft, a young firefighter named Darren Miles. He'd volunteered before anyone asked. As they strapped the harness around his waist, he looked down into the hole and his expression hardened. He knew what he might find, and what he might not. When Darren descended, the air grew thick. Every foot he went down, the smell worsened. He gagged behind his mask, but kept moving, flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. "Almost there," someone called from above. He didn't answer. He reached the bottom and froze. There she was, a small form curled against the damp wall, skin pale and covered in grime. Her hair clung to her face. Her lips barely moved. Darren dropped to his knees, forcing himself to stay calm. He leaned close, his voice soft, almost a whisper. "Hey there, sweetheart. Can you hear me?" Nothing. He brushed her hair back and her eyelids fluttered. A faint noise escaped her throat, a dry, rasping breath. "She's alive!" he shouted upward. "She's alive!" Cheers erupted above, followed by a flurry of movement. The rope tightened as the team prepared to lift her out. Darren wrapped her in a rescue blanket, careful not to press too hard against the burns and bruises that covered her small body. He cradled her close, whispering steady words she was too weak to understand. "You're okay now. You're safe. We've got you." When the team pulled them both up, the crowd around the site fell silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. Lori's body looked impossibly small against the firefighter's chest. Her arms dangled limp, her face half hidden under a layer of mud and ash. The medics rushed in, placing her gently on a stretcher. Her pulse was faint, but it was there. A soft, steady rhythm, stubborn as life itself. Becca stepped forward, her voice breaking. "Will she make it?" No one answered right away. The medics were too busy working, checking her vitals, cutting away dirty clothes, wrapping IV lines around her tiny wrists. Each movement carried a desperate precision, as if time itself was waiting for permission to keep going. They placed an oxygen mask over her face, and her chest rose once, shallow and slow. The sound made grown men cry. Gus turned away, hiding his face in his hands. Becca sank to her knees. Deputy Flynn stood frozen, his radio slipping from his hand. He'd seen death before. He'd seen tragedy. But this was different. This was a miracle born out of horror. When the ambulance finally took off down the mountain road, sirens wailing into the distance, the forest fell silent again. The rescue crew stood in a loose circle, each one lost in thought, unsure whether to celebrate or pray. Flynn watched the taillights disappear and muttered to himself, "She shouldn't be alive. Nobody survives that." But Lori had. Against every rule of nature and every limit of endurance, she had. Back at the site, a deputy gathered evidence, a fragment of fabric, tire impressions in the dirt, the faint outline of boot prints leading away. The story wasn't finished yet. In fact, it had just shifted from tragedy to reckoning. Word spread fast. By the time the ambulance reached the hospital, the news had already hit every radio station in the county. Missing Sheridan girl found alive in mountain outhouse. Reporters swarmed the hospital parking lot. Police worked overtime to hold them back as paramedics carried Lori inside. Doctors rushed her to intensive care. Her body temperature was dangerously low, her skin blistered from chemical burns. But her heartbeat, faint and fragile, refused to stop. When the nurse leaned in to comfort her, she opened her eyes for the first time. The nurse smiled softly, whispering, "You're safe now, sweetheart." Lori's lips trembled as she spoke. Only 4 words. "I live here now." The nurse froze. The room went quiet. And in that stillness, everyone felt the weight of what those words meant, that she'd accepted the darkness as home. By nightfall, Sheridan would know the truth. Lori Miller had been found. But celebration would have to wait. Because every survivor's story carries 2 halves, the miracle and the memory. And some memories refuse to stay buried. By the time the ambulance reached Denver General, the story had already taken on a life of its own. Police scanners hummed. Newsrooms lit up. Radios across Colorado repeated the same impossible sentence. A missing child has been found alive after 4 days. Outside the emergency entrance, reporters pressed against barricades. Microphones hovered like vultures, searching for someone to confirm the rumor. But the officers guarding the doors said nothing. They just stood there, staring through the glass at the blur of nurses rushing down the hallway. Inside, the hospital smelled of antiseptic and adrenaline. Every step echoed. Every voice stayed low, as if speaking too loudly might break the fragile thread that kept Lori alive. Dr. Owens, the attending physician, removed his gloves and spoke softly to the nurse beside him. "She's dehydrated, burned and underweight, but her vitals are holding. Keep her warm. Keep her breathing." The nurse nodded, eyes glistening. She'd worked in emergency medicine for 20 years, but she'd never seen a child endure what this one had. When she adjusted the oxygen mask, Lori stirred. Her hand twitched weakly toward the nurse's wrist. It was barely movement, yet it sent a wave of emotion through the room. Back in Sheridan, phones rang until sunrise. Lieutenant Valdez was halfway through a stale cup of coffee when the call came in. The voice on the other end was shaking. "They found her, sir. She's alive." For a moment, Valdez didn't move. Then he stood, gripping the receiver like it might vanish if he let go. Where? Jefferson County, the old recreation area. A couple hiking found her. Valdez's chest tightened. He exhaled slowly, the disbelief heavier than relief. 4 days of searching, hundreds of false leads, and she'd been 20 miles away, buried in a place no one thought to look. He gathered his coat and shouted for his team. Get the Miller family on the phone. Tell them we've got her. The entire department froze. No one spoke until he repeated it. Only then did the meaning sink in. At the Miller house, Arthur and Elena were sitting in the living room, the TV flickering low, when headlights swept across the window. 2 officers stepped out of the car. Arthur opened the door before they knocked. The look on their faces said it all. Not pity, not sympathy. Something else. Hope. Mr. Miller, one of them said carefully. We found Lori. Elena covered her mouth before the words finished leaving his lips. Arthur just stared. He wanted to ask if she was okay, if she'd speak again, if she'd remember him. But no sound came. All he could manage was a trembling nod. The officers led them inside, explaining what little they knew. Found by hikers, alive, critical but stable. Elena sobbed into Arthur's chest. For the first time in days, he let himself breathe. 2 hours later, they were in the hospital lobby, faces pale, hands locked together. Reporters shouted questions as security pushed them through the corridor. Arthur ignored every voice, every flash of light. He could think only of one thing. His daughter's voice saying his name again. When they reached her room, a nurse stopped them at the door. She's sleeping, she whispered. But you can stand by her. Inside, machines beeped in steady rhythm. Lori lay small and fragile, wrapped in white sheets, skin mottled from burns and exposure. Elena fell to her knees beside the bed. Arthur stood behind her, his hand shaking over the rail. He whispered, "Hey, baby girl." Her eyelids fluttered. She turned her head slightly, eyes unfocused, lips parting to breathe. Arthur leaned closer, tears streaming freely now. "You're home," he said. "You're safe." Her lips moved, barely forming a sound. "I live here now." Arthur froze. He didn't understand. Not yet. Elena buried her face in the sheets and cried. Outside the room, Valdez arrived with his team. He watched through the window, a rare flicker of emotion crossing his face. Then duty returned. "Lock the scene at the foothills," he ordered. "Every tire mark, every footprint. Preserve everything. I want lab results before sunrise." His voice was calm, but his eyes told a different story. Guilt. The kind that asks why it took 4 days, why every clue led nowhere while a child waited in the dark. By midday, the rescue had become national news. Anchors spoke in stunned tones, calling it a miracle in the mountains. But inside the police station, the celebration never started. They still had one name left on the board, Vernon Koss. And now they had something he could never clean away, evidence. A small piece of orange paint had been recovered from the site. It matched the samples taken from Koss's car. Valdez stared at the report, jaw tightening. "This time," he said, "we finish it." When the sun dropped behind the Rockies that night, Sheridan sat in a strange kind of stillness. No one cooked dinner. No one turned on music. People just stood in their kitchens, holding radios close, waiting for the next update. The announcer's voice was soft, almost reverent. 3-year-old Lori Miller, missing since Monday, has been found alive in the foothills west of Denver. Some cried, some prayed. Others just stared at the walls, realizing what it meant. That the nightmare had been real all along. At the police station, Lieutenant Valdez leaned over a table cluttered with photos, evidence bags, and notes that now finally connected. The fragment of orange paint from the mountain matched the car he'd inspected days earlier. Under the microscope, the samples were identical. Same layer, same chemical mix. He didn't smile. He just exhaled, long and slow, like a man who'd been holding his breath for too long. "Get the warrant," he said. Two detectives nodded and disappeared down the hall. The room erupted into motion, radios calling for units, printers spitting out paperwork, the sudden energy of people who'd been drowning in helplessness, and finally found a foothold. Outside, rain began to fall, thin, cold, relentless. They reached Vernon Koss's apartment just before midnight. The building was quiet. The neighbors pretended not to watch through their curtains. Valdez waited at the bottom of the stairwell until the team was in position. When the battering ram struck, the door splintered in one hit. Koss didn't run. He stood in the middle of the room, still wearing the same faded work shirt from his last interview, hands at his sides. "Turn around," Valdez ordered. Koss obeyed without a word. The cuffs clicked, metal against bone. For the first time, Valdez caught something in his eyes. Not fear, not shock. Something smaller. Relief. As they led him out into the hallway, cameras flashed through the rain-streaked windows. The town had waited 4 days for this image. The man in cuffs, the supposed monster, exposed to the light. But even then, Valdez knew the truth was heavier than justice could carry. There was no victory here. Only survival. Back at the hospital, the Millers refused to leave Lori's bedside. Machines hummed softly, casting rhythmic beeps through the dim room. Elena dozed in a chair, her hand resting over Lori's small fingers. Arthur stood by the window, staring at the city lights below. He thought about the men arresting Koss, about the hours he'd spent combing fields while his daughter lay underground. Guilt and gratitude warred quietly inside him. Both felt undeserved. When a nurse entered to check Lori's IV, Arthur asked, "Will she remember any of it?" The nurse paused. "She might remember the dark," she said. "Kids remember sounds, smells, moments." Then she looked up. "But she's breathing. That's what matters tonight." Arthur nodded, whispering a thank you that barely reached his lips. At 2 a.m., Valdez arrived at the hospital still soaked from the rain. He carried the arrest report under his arm, the ink smudged where water had touched it. Arthur met him in the hallway. "Is it over?" he asked. Valdez hesitated. "We have him. We have evidence. It's as close to over as this kind of thing gets." Arthur stared at him for a long moment, then turned back toward the door. "I just want her to wake up," he said. Valdez watched him disappear into the room, then walked to the waiting area and sat down alone. For the first time since Monday, he allowed himself to close his eyes. The sound of rain against the windows filled the silence. At dawn, the storm passed. The streets glistened. The mountains cut sharp outlines against the pale sky. Sheridan was quiet again, but the quiet wasn't peaceful. It was cautious, fragile, like something that could break if you breathed too hard. Inside the Miller house, the phone rang non-stop with messages from neighbors, reporters, strangers. Arthur unplugged it. Elena made coffee she didn't drink. They didn't need words that morning. They needed air that didn't taste like fear. Lori slept, machines beeping steadily beside her. Each breath she took sounded like a promise the world had tried to steal. By the time the arrest made national headlines, Sheridan had already moved past celebration. No parade, no speeches, just a collective exhale from people who'd learned how thin the line is between normal life and nightmare. And somewhere in that thin line, a child was still fighting to heal. The town would never be the same, but for the first time in 4 days, morning light felt possible again. The first sunrise after Lori's rescue felt unreal. The same sky, the same quiet streets, but nothing was the same anymore. Outside the hospital, cameras lined the parking lot. Reporters whispered into microphones while nurses hurried past, shielding the windows from the lenses. The world wanted a miracle story, but inside, the Millers were living something far more fragile, the aftermath. Elena sat beside her daughter's bed, hands clasped in her lap, watching each shallow breath like it might stop if she blinked. Arthur stood near the foot of the bed, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the heart monitor. The sound, that rhythmic, delicate beeping, had become their new kind of silence. Every few hours, doctors entered with cautious smiles. They used words like stable, responsive, healing. But the truth was simpler. She was alive. And somehow that was enough. When Lori finally woke, it wasn't with the sudden clarity that movies show. It was slower, a child's confusion fighting through exhaustion. Her eyes opened halfway, then closed again. Her lips parted like she wanted to speak, but no sound came. Elena leaned close, whispering her name. "Sweetheart, it's Mommy. You're safe. You're home." Lori blinked, staring at her face. There was recognition there, faint, uncertain, but it was there. A tear slid down Elena's cheek as she kissed her daughter's forehead. Arthur turned away, pressing his hand against the wall to steady himself. Doctors kept reporters away, but stories always find their way out. By evening, the news had spread across the country. Missing girl found alive after 4 days underground. People called it a miracle. For a few days, Sheridan became the town that hope rebuilt, but not everyone felt like celebrating. At the police station, Lieutenant Valdez sat in the dark, the case file open in front of him. He'd watched the footage of the rescue a dozen times. Every time the same question haunted him. How had they missed it? How had a child stayed hidden for 4 days while hundreds searched just miles away? He told himself they'd done their best, that they'd worked every lead. But deep down, he knew the truth. Sometimes, best isn't enough. He rubbed his eyes and whispered into the empty room. We should have found her sooner. Outside his office, the evidence technicians were cataloging the items retrieved from the foothills. The rope used to lower her, the remains of a blanket, traces of orange paint. Every piece spoke the same language: guilt, cruelty, patience, and all of it pointed to one man. 2 days after the rescue, Vernon Koss was led into the county courthouse in cuffs. He didn't resist, didn't look at the cameras or the crowd that screamed his name. He just stared at the ground. The sheriff's voice was firm as he read the charges: kidnapping, assault, attempted murder. Reporters fought for sound bites. Someone yelled, "Why'd you do it?" Koss didn't answer. He just smiled, faintly, a hollow, meaningless gesture that made even the officers uneasy. Inside the courtroom, Valdez watched from the back row. He'd been in law enforcement for years, but he'd never felt anger like this, not because of the crime itself, but because of how ordinary the man looked. There was no monster, no mask, no warning. Just another face in the crowd. Outside, people left flowers at the Miller home, stuffed animals piled on the porch. Candles flickered long into the night. A community that had been broken now wanted redemption. But inside that house, redemption didn't come so easily. Elena avoided mirrors. Arthur avoided sleep. Every sound, the creak of a floorboard, the hum of the refrigerator, felt amplified, sharp. Sometimes in the middle of the night, Lori would cry out. Not loudly, just a faint, panicked noise that made Elena's chest seize. She'd rush to her daughter's side, hold her close, whisper over and over, "You're home, you're safe." But Lori would just stare into the dark, as if listening to something only she could hear. And sometimes she'd whisper the same words that had shaken everyone at the rescue site. "I live here now." Elena would close her eyes and hold her tighter. In public, the Millers became symbols of hope. In private, they were survivors learning how to live again. And across town, the man who stole those 4 days sat in a concrete cell waiting for trial. But the question that haunted everyone wasn't about guilt. That part was clear. It was about something deeper. How does a family go back to normal when the world they trusted proved it couldn't protect them? The courthouse smelled of rain and paper. Rows of spectators filled the benches, murmuring softly as officers led Vernon Koss to his seat. He didn't look up. He didn't look at the cameras or at the family sitting only a few feet away. Arthur sat rigid beside Elena, his hands locked together so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. Elena's face was pale, her eyes fixed on the table in front of her. She hadn't spoken since they walked in. Every breath sounded measured, like she was forcing herself to stay upright. The prosecutor's voice echoed through the room, calm and sharp. He described the orange sedan, the fibers found in the trunk, the paint fragments that matched the rescue site. He spoke of motive, opportunity, evidence. Every word was another nail sealing the case shut. Arthur didn't hear the legal jargon. He only heard Laurie's voice in his head, repeating the same line over and over. I live here now. When the nurse testified about the burns, Elena turned away. Arthur placed a hand on her back, but she didn't react. He couldn't blame her. There are some things a human mind shouldn't have to picture, especially when they wear your child's face. During a break in testimony, Valdez walked past the family in the hallway. He looked older, not from years, but from the weight of it all. Arthur stood and shook his hand. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Valdez said quietly, "We got him." Arthur nodded, but the look in his eyes said what his mouth didn't. It's not enough. Inside, the defense offered no surprises. Koss showed no remorse, no panic, no plea for mercy. He just sat, eyes forward, as if he'd already left his body behind. When the jury returned, the foreman stood and read the verdict, guilty on all counts. A collective breath swept through the courtroom. The crowd whispered. Some cried. Others applauded. Arthur stayed still. Elena leaned into him, whispering, "It's over." But he didn't believe that. Not really. Outside, reporters swarmed the steps, shoving microphones at anyone who looked like they belonged to the story. Flashes burst like lightning. Valdez spoke briefly. "The investigation is closed. Justice has been served." His voice held conviction, but not peace. Behind him, Arthur and Elena walked silently toward their car. The noise of the crowd felt distant, muffled, as though it belonged to another world. Arthur opened the door for Elena, and for a moment he looked back at the courthouse. He wanted to feel something, victory, relief, closure, but there was only emptiness. He whispered to himself, "She came back. That's all that matters." That night, Sheridan was quiet again. The trial had ended, the headlines had begun to fade, and the town seemed ready to forget. But forgetting isn't healing. It's just quieter. At the Miller house, Laurie slept with a small nightlight glowing in the corner. Elena sat beside her, tracing circles on her daughter's hand. Arthur stood at the doorway watching them. He knew that justice had been delivered, but it hadn't brought peace. Peace doesn't come from verdicts, it comes from time. And sometimes, not even then. When Elena finally looked up, her voice trembled. "Do you think she'll remember?" Arthur didn't answer right away. He walked over, kneeling beside the bed. Laurie stirred, turning toward the light, breathing softly. "I think," he said quietly, "she already does." Outside, a soft breeze moved through the trees. The town slept, unaware that the story they'd followed for days would live on for decades. Because what happened to Laurie Miller wasn't just an abduction. It was a reminder. A reminder that innocence can vanish faster than we can protect it, and that vigilance isn't paranoia. It's survival. Weeks passed. The trial ended, the cameras disappeared, and Sheridan went back to mowing lawns and walking dogs as if nothing had happened. But inside the Miller home, time hadn't moved at all. The red tricycle sat in the garage, untouched. Elena couldn't bring herself to throw it away. Arthur tried once, lifting it halfway into the trash bin before lowering it back down. It stayed there, neither kept nor discarded, like a memory they couldn't decide what to do with. Laurie's body healed faster than anyone expected, but the mind works at its own pace. She smiled now sometimes. She colored pictures with Toby and watched cartoons, but every night before bed, she insisted on keeping a light on. She said darkness had a voice. Elena listened each time her daughter spoke, wondering if the words were fragments of memory or pieces of nightmares. She never asked. Some questions don't need answers, they just need patience. Arthur began volunteering with the search and rescue team that had once looked for his child. He didn't tell Elena why. But every time a call came through about another missing person, even a stranger, he went. He told himself it was duty, but deep down, it was atonement. Lieutenant Valdez retired the following spring. Before leaving his office for the last time, he stood staring at Lori's case file, now sealed and archived. He traced his finger along the label and whispered, "We found her." But the words didn't sound triumphant. They sounded like confession. Outside, the world had already moved on. A new headline, a new tragedy. That's how stories fade. But this one refused to. Every few months, someone would mention it on the local news. The case of the little girl who whispered from the ground. And each time, a hush would fall across the room, as if everyone remembered exactly where they were when they first heard her voice. One afternoon, years later, Elena took Lori back to the foothills. Not to the site itself, that was still cordoned off and grown over, but to a trail nearby. The girl, now older, held her mother's hand tightly as they walked. They stopped at a lookout point where the wind carried the faint hum of traffic from the highway below. Lori looked up at her mother and asked, "Why did he take me?" Elena froze. No parent is ready for that question. She knelt, meeting her daughter's eyes. "I don't know," she said softly. "Some people don't see children. They see opportunity. They take what isn't theirs." Lori nodded slowly, her gaze drifting toward the horizon. After a long silence, she said, "I don't remember his face. Just the dark." Elena wrapped her arms around her. "That's enough remembering," she whispered. They stood like that until the wind grew colder, and then they turned back toward the car. Neither spoke for the rest of the drive home. That night, as rain tapped lightly against the windows, Arthur watched the evening news. Another missing child report flashed across the screen. A different family, a different town, the same hollow plea. He muted the volume and sat there in silence. The sound of the storm outside felt too familiar. He closed his eyes, hearing again that faint, broken voice echoing from the earth. He whispered, "We heard you, baby girl. Someone else will hear them too." Lori was saved because two strangers stopped and listened. Most people would have kept walking. Most people do. If that silence ever comes again, will you hear it or scroll past it? Don't be the one who ignores the next whisper. Before you go, please hit the subscribe button now. And never miss the truth hiding under ordinary days. Some stories remind us of cruelty. This one reminds us of neglect. The danger of believing horror belongs somewhere else. Because monsters aren't only the ones who act, they're also the ones who notice nothing. The neighbor who assumes the cry is just a dog. The passerby who convinces themselves it's not their business. The silence between two breaths when help could have spoken. Lori's voice came from the ground, small and fading, but it carried far enough to change a town, maybe even a country. She survived because someone cared enough to stop, and in the end, that's the question that lingers long after the story ends. When the next whisper reaches your ears, will you?